In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this fully fledged weather app using JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. This is using all entirely free APIs, which is great, and it's going to teach you great skills around data parsing, API access, CSS styling, and so on. And also, it's just a great project for your resume. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And today we're going to be building the weather app that you can see on the side, which has a bunch of hourly information, and at the top it has daily information and current information. And this is going to be pulling from your exact location, which is really cool. Now, to actually use this weather API, we're going to be using the Open Media Weather API, and this is a completely free API. All you do is just call a URL and it gives you back information, no API keys needed, which is great. But before we get started with actually implementing the API, we first need to set up our project and actually start using some HTML. So to do that, we're going to be using Vite. So if you just type in npm, and we can say init, or npm, sorry, create, and we want to say Vite at latest, that's going to download and start a Vite project for us. We can call it whatever we want, or we can just put period, and that's going to create this in our current project. We want to use vanilla JavaScript, and we're going to be using JavaScript, not TypeScript. Now, if I type in npm i, that'll install all of the packages being used for this project. So just give that a second, and then we can run npm run dev, and that's going to start up our project for you. And as you can see right here, our project is running. Now, by default, this is going to give us a bunch of files we don't necessarily need. So everything in our style sheet, I'm going to just remove. Everything in our main JavaScript, I'm going to remove. There we go. So if I'm going to import my styles.css in here, just so we have those styles. Those should be imported, and sorry, it's called style.css. So if we just change the body to have a background of red, that should work. Yep, that works, perfect. So now what we can do inside the counter, we don't even need this file, let's remove that. In our public folder, we can get rid of SVG since we're not using it. Same with this SVG. In our HTML, we can get rid of this link for that SVG we're not using. We can get rid of the title since we're not using it. And we can get rid of this right here. So all we're left with is just essentially a mostly empty HTML file that's importing our JavaScript that we have right here, which is importing our CSS. We could also import the CSS in here if you want. It's entirely up to you. Now, the only other thing we need for this project is going to be all of our icons. I'm going to copy those into this folder. It's just a bunch of SVGs that I'm using Font Awesome for. These are all completely free SVGs you can use yourself. And I'm going to have them linked in the GitHub repository so you can install them and download them yourself, or you can just go to Font Awesome and get them. Now, to get started, let's write our HTML so it looks exactly like what we have over here, because we want to have a shell of the page that shows up first, because when I refresh, you'll notice for a split second we have a blurred out version of the page that renders first, and then the actual content loads behind. So if you have a slow internet connection, it at least gives you something to look at. So what we want to do here is we're going to come in and we're going to select our header, and that's going to be this top section right here. Also, if you're curious where I got the idea and the design for this project, this is actually straight from my JavaScript Simplified course. This course right here pretty much covers everything you would ever need to know about JavaScript to land a full-time job as a JavaScript developer. I mean, in this course, I cover more than I even knew when I first started learning JavaScript. And as you can see, the video lists are quite large. This is just one of the modules inside the course. We also have like a beginner course and so on. So this is an absolutely massive course on JavaScript. And if you're interested in learning more about JavaScript and tackling large projects like this, I highly recommend you check it out. It'll be linked down in the description below. So to get started with our header, the first thing we want to do is give it a class so we can select it. So I'm going to give it a class of header, and you may be wondering why I give it a class of header instead of just selecting the actual header element. This just makes it easier for me to write CSS that's flexible, and if I want to add a header somewhere else on my page, I'm not going to be breaking my code by doing that. Now inside the header, we have two sections. We have this left side and this right side, so let's create divs for that. We're going to have a header on the left, and we're going to have a header on the right. Our left side header is going to be relatively simple because we're just going to have an image. This image is going to be for our icon. So let's just come in here. We can say the class is going to be a weather icon to style our icon. And we're going to make this a large icon because as you can see, this is larger than all the other icons on our page. Those are going to be our classes. For the source, we're just going to give this a default source of icons/sun.svg. So it shows the sun icon. And then finally, I'm going to add a data attribute onto this called current icon. And this is so in the JavaScript, I can really easily select this image and actually change what the image source is going to be based on my weather itself. So if I give this a save, you can see we have a giant sun icon showing up just because we don't have any CSS styles yet. The next thing I want to do is next to that, put essentially the text 31 degrees or whatever the current temperature is. So we're going to have a div and I'm going to give it some classes. We're going to give it the class of header, current temp, just like that. And then also inside of this, I'm going to have a span that's going to tell me the temperature. So in our case, let's just put 31. That's what's on our screen right now. And then I'm going to say data current temp, so we can select that inside of our JavaScript. Now, the reason I put this inside of a span is because I want to have the degree symbol outside that span. So let's put the degree symbol in. If we look over here, you can see it says the text 31 degrees. If I just zoom in a little bit, you can see that's easier to read. Now, the reason, again, I put this in a span is so I can select the span, change the number inside of it without actually removing or changing my degree symbol. Now let's zoom back to what we had before. You can see we have this vertical line that's going to be CSS, and then we have these 6 sections over here on the right. So inside of our header right, we want to have those 6 sections, and we're just going to use CSS grid for laying those out. So I'm just going to put all the sections side by side so we can have essentially multiple different info groups. And inside our info groups, we're going to have a label, which this one's just going to say hi, for example. And then we're going to have a value, which is going to be inside a div. And that's because, again, I want this degree symbol to be separate. So I'm going to have a span, which is going to say data current hi, just like that. And then we can put whatever the temperature we want in there, for example, 32 degrees, and we can put the degree symbol, just like that. So now if we come over here, you can see we have a high of 32 degrees. Now we just need to do that with all of the other sections. So essentially, we're just going to copy this down, and all we do is we change the label. In our case, this next one is FL high, and we're just going to go essentially right to or left to right. So for this one, let's do 27 degrees, and we can just copy that down. So I'll just jump to when I have all of these done. There we go. I just finished writing out all 6 of those sections, and you can see we have all 6 of them right here, but there's a few other changes we need to make. First of all, we need to change our data attributes for all of these. So this one currently is going to be the FL-high. We're going to have one for our wind. This next one is going to be for our low. Then we're going to have our FL low, and then finally our precipitation. Now, the only other thing we need to take into account is you notice this miles per hour and this inch text is quite a bit smaller than this 0.01 and this 9. We're going to put those inside of their own span, which is going to have a class which we can use to denote that this is going to be that smaller size. So inside of a span, we're just going to give that a class here of value. Whoops, make sure I put that inside of there. Value sub info. And that's just essentially, again, saying that this is a smaller section of information, so we should make it look smaller. So again, same exact thing for our miles per hour. Just like that. So when I save and we come over here, nothing actually changes about the styles. We still have the text being larger, but in CSS, we can make it smaller. So now before we move on to styling all the rest of this with HTML, I want to get the styles for this top section done. So in our style sheet, let's do a few styles here. The first one I want to do is style my before and my after elements and just everything to make it be a box sizing of border box, just like that. Then in my body, I'm going to set the margin to 0. We're going to set the background color to HSL 200, 100%, and 85%. That's a light blue color. Now we're going to set our actual text color to be very similar, 200, 100%, and 10%. So it's going to be a very dark blue version, almost black. Finally, for our font family, I want this to be sans serif. And if we look back over here, you can see our colors have changed and our font has changed slightly. Now the next thing to work on that we need to do is our header. And for our header, we just want to have this be a display of flex. So the left and right side are showing up next to each other. I'm going to align all the items in the center, just like that. So now as you can see, everything's center aligned and we have everything right to left, just like that. Next, what I want to do is I want to do the header section on the left. So we can say header left. This is going to have a display of flex, again, to line up items right next to each other. I also want to make this quite a bit wider. So we're going to say width 50%. We're going to align the items in the center. We're going to justify the content in the center as well. And just doing that, you can see everything has been centered exactly as we want it to be. We're going to set some margin on this to give it some space from its container, 0.5 rem. We're going to do the same thing with some padding, 0.5 rem. Again, give it some space. And then finally, a border on the right, which is 2 pixels, solid. And we're going to use that really dark color again, 200, 100%, and 10%. So now you can see it's giving us that border on the right-hand side. Now to finish up that left-hand side, let's work on our weather icon because this is way too big. So we're going to have our default icon, which is going to be a width of 40 pixels, a height of 40 pixels, and we're going to give it an object fit of contain, which is just going to make sure that the actual aspect ratio of the image is stored properly. Now for ours, we want this to be larger, so we're going to do weather icon large, and we're going to set the width and height to 80 pixels instead, just like that. So now we have a larger icon, which is what we want. Now the next thing we want to do is style our text right here because, as you can see over here, it is a much larger text. This is going to be super straightforward. We already gave that a class of current temp in the header. This is going to double our font size to 2 rem, And we're going to set some margin on the left to space it out from the icon of 1 rem. And there we go. Now that section is pretty much done. Next, we're going to have our right section. So this is going to be header right. As I already mentioned, we're going to be using grid for this section, so we can change the display here to grid. We want the width again to be 50%, same as the other side. And then we can come in here and we can say we want to justify our content space around just to make sure that everything is spaced out properly. Give some gap between our different elements, 0.5 rem. And if you save, you can see everything is centered currently. Now we need to determine how many columns we have. Well, in our case, we know that we have 3 columns and we want them to be auto-sized. So we can just say repeat 3 auto. And for our rows, again, super simple. We know that we have 2 rows, so we can just say we want 2 auto-sized rows. And now you can see we have our columns and our rows showing up exactly as we want, but our sections don't look that great. So for our info group, let's change the display here to flex. We want to change the flex direction to column, and then we want to line everything up in the center, so we'll do a line item center. This little bit of code is just lining up everything centered for us. The next thing I want to do is style out the labels that we're using. So first of all, I want to do a text transform. This is a really cool property, which allows me to make my text uppercase by default. I want to change the font weight here to bold, and I want to make the font size much smaller because it's pretty large. So we'll do 0.6 rem. As you can see, that already looks a lot better. And finally for this, I want to change the color to be slightly lighter. So it's just a slightly different color. So in our case, we're going to use 20% instead of 10%. And that's just going to make it a slightly different color. Finally, we're going to get the sub info of our value. I want to just change the font weight here to be lighter. So it's going to be essentially a less bold font. And I want to make the font size smaller. We'll do 0.75 rem. And that's just making this miles per hour in this inch section a little bit smaller. And now if you compare these two values, they are pretty much identical to each other, which is exactly what we want. Now, the only other thing I want to do is you'll notice, like I mentioned, when I refresh the page, we get that blurred out background. To do this, I'm going to add a simple blur class to our body. So we can say class is blurred. Make sure I put that inside the body. There we go. And now inside of our CSS, we can just select our body. Let's just do this at the top here. We can say dot blurred. What I want to do is I want to add a filter, which is just going to be a blur of 3 pixels and an overflow of hidden, just so we can't scroll our content. Now, as you can see, we get that blurred out body, and that's just from this blur right there. Now, obviously, we don't want that while we're doing all this. So for now, I'm just going to remove that and we can add that back in later once we're done with all the styling of everything. So let's minimize out our header here and move on to our next section, which you can see is like this day section right here. So I'm going to create a section and we're just going to give it the class of day section. And then I'm going to give it a data attribute of day section again, so I can select this in my JavaScript. Now, if you're curious why I use data attributes in JavaScript and classes for CSS, I have a blog article on that. I'll link down in the description for you. It kind of goes into the inside of why I think this is better. Now for this, we're going to have a bunch of cards. I'm going to call them day cards. And inside these cards, we have an image, some text, and some more text. So we're going to have an image. And inside this image, we're going to give it a source. Let's just say icons cloud.svg. It really doesn't matter. Get rid of the alt tag here for now. And we're going to give it a class, which is just weather icon. There we go. So if we come over here, you can see we have a small little cloud icon. That looks really good. Next, we're going to have a div, and this is going to be our day card date, just like that. So for example, Monday will be our very first date in our case. I'm recording this on a Thursday, which is why Thursday is the first date here. Lastly, we're going to have a final div, and this div is just going to have our temperature, whatever it's going to be. So in our case, we'll just do like 32 degrees. Now, one thing I do want to mention is you'll notice I didn't separate this degree into its own span, and I didn't add any data attributes for anything inside this card. And the reason for that is because I want to actually create a template, which is going to be our day card. So we can create an HTML element called a template. And this template is essentially going to copy a lot of the content inside of here, but a lot of these sections like this are going to be completely blank. And that way, when we actually use JavaScript to populate this information, we can just create our day cards from this template instead of using the ones that are pre-built into the page, because we don't know exactly how many rows we're going to have or exactly how many days we're going to show. It really depends on what the weather app data returns to us. It may return to us 7 days, it may return 6. It really depends on if the API changes in the future. So this gives us more flexibility, but these hard-coded values give us something to show on the page while it's loading the data in the background for the user. So obviously I'm going to copy this down just a couple more times. We're going to do like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And there we go. That's going to be 7 for us. I'm just going to change the data in them real quick. And there we go. I just finished adding all those different days. And that's all the HTML for our day section essentially done. We can move on to styling it, which shouldn't be that hard because it's really just a simple card like this. So the first thing we want to style is that day section. So let's come in here. We're going to use a display of grid for this one as well. But this time, instead of hard-coded columns, we're going to be doing a repeat, which is an auto fit. In our case, we're going to do 75 pixels. There we go. So that's how wide our cards are going to be. If we just save, you can see they're now showing up. And based on the size of our screen, we're showing more or less of those, which is exactly what we want. Next, I want to add some space between them. Let's do 0.5 rem. I'm going to justify my content in the center. And then finally, let's add some padding to make it so that we have some space between the edges of our card, because as you can see here, our card has some space on the edge. Next, I want to style the actual card itself. That's going to be pretty straightforward. So we're going to say day card. We're going to use a display of flex for this. And our flex direction is going to be column, just to stack everything. We're going to align our items in the center. Again, this is just for centering things. Finally, I'm going to give it a border, 1 pixel, solid. Whoops, solid. And this is going to be that dark color again. So we're going to use that 10%. And then finally, I'm going to give it a rounded corner, 0.25 rem. And then some padding, 0.25 rem. There we go. So now you can see we have the beginnings of our card, which is great. Our date is obviously a bit too big though. So day card date, let's shrink that down. We can say font size is going to be 0.75 rem. We're going to put some color inside of here, which is again going to be that slightly lighter color that we used for all of our labels. And then our margin on the top is going to be 0.5 rem. There we go. Give that a quick save. And it looks like that didn't quite work. If we check our HTML, it looks like I used day card day. So let's change this to day. And there we go. That actually worked. Now that's all that there is for our day section. So we can move on to our hour section. So let's just minimize this down. We can move over here to see what the hour section looks like. And it looks like it's just a really simple table. So we can come in here, we can create a table, which is going to have a class of that hour section. Then what we can do inside that table is we can have a t-body, t-body, and this t-body is going to have a data attribute called hour section. So we can select the actual body of our table inside of our JavaScript. Now we're going to need to have some rows, and each one of these is going to have the row or the class of our row, just like that. And then we're going to need to have some different elements inside of here. It looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different of these. So we can just copy that down 6 different times. Now inside the very first one, we're going to want to have an info group. And that's because we've already defined a style that looks the exact same as this stuff down here. So we might as well use that. So we have our info group, just like that. And inside this info group, we know that we can have a label. In our case, let's make this say Thursday. There we go. And then we can have a label that's going to have the time. So we'll just do a div here that says 3 p.m. There we go. Next thing that we need to do inside of our table is we need to add our image. So we can have an image that has the class of weather icon, just like that. Inside of our source, we'll do icons/clouds.svg. I think it's actually just cloud. There we go. And we'll remove that alt tag. So if we just look at this, you can see that that's coming along pretty well. Next row that we have is going to be essentially the same as this. We're just going to copy this down because all the rest of our rows look almost exactly the same. We just need to change the label, which in our case is our temperature. And we need to change here our value, which is 31. And then we have the degree symbol. So let's just say ampersand degree. There we go. I'm going to copy that down again because we're going to have our feels like temp, just like that. And this one is 25. And then I'm going to copy that down again for our wind. And then for our precipitation. So for our wind here, we're going to have a value which is 6 miles per hour. And we just need to make sure that we have a span that has the class of value sub info to get that smaller styling for our miles per hour. Just like that. And then I'll finally copy this down one last time for our precipitation. Just like that. And we'll just say in our case, 0 inches. And now if we look, you can see we have a full row of our table. Now what we can do is we can just minimize that row and we can just copy it down a bunch of times. It doesn't really matter. There we go, that looks like a bunch of times. Enough that we just have content on our page and we don't even need to really worry about updating these dates. I mean, we can if we want, but it doesn't matter too much. Okay, I decided just to go through and update them all anyway. Again, it doesn't matter too much what the actual page looks like because we already know we're going to have it blurred out. So if we say class is blurred, you can see it's already really hard to read what anything says anyway, so it really doesn't matter too much. Now for our styling, this is going to be pretty straightforward. First, we need to tell our hour section to take up the full screen size because right now it's not. So we can say that the width is 100%. And we also can say we want our text to be lined up in the center. And this is going to be our border spacing. We want this to be 0 just because we don't want the spacing of our borders to do anything. As you can see with this property there or not there, it changes our spacing a little bit. And this is just a table property essentially. Next, we're going to have our rows. And for each one of our rows, all we want to do is set the background color. So we can say background color is HSL. We want to use that same hue and saturation and lightness we've been using, 200, 100%. And in our case, we're going to use 75%. And then I'm going to copy this down because I want to have every other row have a slightly different color. So we'll say nth child 2n. That'll give us every other row. And I'm going to change this to 70% so it's slightly darker. So now you can see our rows have this slightly different color, which matches what we have over here. These ones are a bit more bright though, so we're going to bump down our saturation to about 60%. And as you can see, that kind of desaturates it and makes it a little bit less eye-catching, which is good. Now the last thing I want to do is just add a little bit of padding. So we can say our hour row, and we want to select each TD inside of there, so each element itself. Change the padding to be 0.25 REM and 0.5 REM. Again, give them a little bit of space, make it a little bit easier to read the data. Now this covers us for almost all of our HTML. The only thing that we have left in our HTML is to actually create the templates we're going to be using, like I mentioned at the beginning. So we're going to need a template that's going to be for our day card. So we're going to have a template for that. And then we're also going to need a template for our row. So for the day card, I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to copy what we have for an existing day card. I'm going to put that inside of the template. And all I want to do is just remove everything we don't need. So I can remove, for example, the source from this image, but I'm going to add a data attribute of data icon onto that. Same thing here for our day card. We don't need the text inside of here, but I'm going to put data date on here. Then inside of this div, we're going to have to split this out so it has a span. So we're going to say span here. And I'm going to give this div itself another span to wrap the number. There we go. And we can just give this a simple data attribute of our temperature, and we can remove the text in there because we don't actually need it. So now we have a way to set the temperature, the date, and the icon for our date card. Now the next thing that we can move on to is our hour row template. And again, I'm just going to bump inside of here, take one of our rows, copy it completely. I'm going to paste it down inside of here. Now all we need to do is go to all the places where we have data. For example, right here, we have a date. So we're going to say data day to get that date. Let's just remove the text. We don't need it. Same thing here. This data is going to change. So we'll give it a data attribute data time and remove the minimum text. Also, here's our icon. So let's say data icon, and we can remove that source. Next up here, we have some more information. Right here, we're going to be using our temp, and we're going to use that same span trick. So I'm just going to copy that span over where we have our temp. I'm just going to paste that down. Data temp, that works just fine because that's what this is. Let's remove that old value. You can do the same exact thing here for our feels like temp. I'm just going to change the data attribute to the feels like temp so we know which one we're selecting. For our wind, we're going to have something very similar. I'm going to have a span that has our number 26 inside of it. We can just remove the number because we don't need it, and this will just say data wind. Then we're going to do essentially the exact same thing for our precipitation. So I'll just copy this down, and this will say data precip. Now that we're finally done with all of our HTML, you can see everything looks exactly the same as on the other version of our application, which is great. Now we can finally move on to the JavaScript and actually using this weather API right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it weather.js. And this is where we're essentially going to export a function called getWeather. And this getWeather function is going to take a latitude, and it's going to take a longitude, and it's also going to end up taking a time zone. And that's just because of how this API works. We want all the dates to be in our current time zone. So with that out of the way, what I want to do is I want to expand this page so we can really see what we're working with. And as you can see down here, we essentially have a URL builder, which allows us to build out a URL that we can just copy paste into our application. So we're going to take in a latitude, longitude. We'll just leave this defaulted for now. And then we want to figure out what we want. Well, of course, for our hourly weather, if we look at our page, we need to have the temperature, the feels like temperature, the wind, and the precipitation, as well as whatever this icon is going to be. So to do that, here's our temperature. That's perfect. Our apparent temperature, that's like our feels like. Here's our precipitation, which is what we want. The weather code is how we're going to get the actual icon. And then finally, we're going to get the wind speed at 10 meters above ground level. That seems perfect. Next, we're going to move on. We need to get our daily weather information. So if we look at our application and we scroll up to daily, all we need is the temperature and the weather icon. So that'll be pretty simple, weather icon. And we don't have an actual current temperature, so I'm just going to use the maximum temperature for the day in this scenario. You will notice though, we're actually going to need a little bit more data than that though, because we have the high, the feels like high, the wind, precipitation, and the low data for the current day. So we need to get all of that information as well as the current temperature. So we need the minimum, we need the apparent temperatures, as well as we need the precipitation here. And finally, we're going to want to get that wind speed. But this wind speed here is not quite what we want, so we're actually going to uncheck that, and instead we can check this current weather with temperature, wind speed, and weather code. So this will give us the current temp, current wind speed, and the current weather code, which is great because that'll give us the icon that we want, this temperature, as well as the wind over here. That's all the data we want. Then we say what units we want. I'm going to be using Fahrenheit, and I'm going to be using miles per hour because I live in the US. Same thing here, we're going to be using inches. For our time format, we're going to use timestamps because it's a little bit easier for us to work with. And then here we need to set our time zone. So for my example, I'm in the central time zone, so this American Chicago time zone. We're going to set this dynamically with JavaScript, but for now, that's what we're going to use as our time zone. Click Preview Chart, and that's going to load up all of our information in this chart. But most importantly, it's going to have this URL API. Click Open in a new tab, and you can see we get a bunch of JavaScript being returned to us. We can actually copy that URL and use that inside of our application. So for now, I'm just going to come up here. I'm going to put a comment that has that URL. So this is the full URL to get all of our information. And all we need to do is dynamically add in our latitude, our longitude, as well as our time zone, which we're passing into our function right here. So in order to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to be using a library called Axios. So we can just say npm i Axios. This is just a fetching library, which makes fetching a little bit easier. So now that we have that installed, I can actually import that library by saying that I want to import Axios from Axios. There we go. And then inside of our get weather, what I can do is I can say axios.get, and we can pass it in a URL. So for now, we're just going to pass it in the start portion of our URL, everything before our query parameters right here. And then what I want to do is I want to define all of our query parameters inside of our JavaScript. So we can just say params, and then we can pass in all of our query parameters. So in our case, we have a latitude parameter, which is just the same parameter we have up here. We're going to set to the latitude we pass in. Same thing for our longitude. That's just going to be passed in as our lon parameter right here. And then we have our time zone, which we're going to pass in just exactly as is. Now what I could do is I could just remove the latitude and the longitude here from our URL, and I could remove our time zone since we're dynamically setting those, and I could just copy all of what's left over and put it at the end of our forecast right here, and that'll work just fine. This is going to do our query for us exactly as we want. But we could change this, and we could move the params from here into our params list down here. It's entirely up to your preference. Whatever you want to do, either way is going to work just fine. So for now, to test this out, let's just return this right here, this return from our axios.get. There we go, return that value to us. And then inside of our main, let's make sure we import that get weather from weather. And we can just call get weather, and let's just pass it in 10 and 10 as our latitude and longitude. And to get our time zone is actually really easy. All we need to do is just say intl.datetime_format. And then what we want to do is we want to get the resolved options, and we want to get the time zone from that. This right here is just going to give us whatever the current time zone that we are in is. So now what I want to do is I just want to get the value of this, so we can say .then, because this will return to us a promise, which is going to have a result. And we can just console log res.data, and that's going to be the data returned to us from the API. So now inside of here, if I just inspect our page, and I pull this over, we should inside of our console have an object that contains all of the different data that we need. As you can see, latitude, longitude, we have our time zone, and then we have all of our data that's our current weather right here. We have data for daily, as you can see, all the different things that we're selecting. Same thing for the units we're using, as well as our hourly and our hourly units right here. So what I want to do is I want to take this fairly ugly data that's returned to us, and I want to process that data into something that we can use inside of our application. So if we go to this weather section here, instead of just returning the return of this, I want to do a simple .then here. I want to use that data value that we've gotten, and I want to return to us something brand new. I want to return an object that has the current weather that we need. I want to return our daily weather, and I want to return our hourly weather, just like this, because that's what we need. We need our current, daily, and hourly weather. So for our current, we're just going to create a function called parse current weather and pass in our data. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for daily and hourly. So instead of current, we'll just say daily. And instead of current down here, we will say hourly. And let's just make sure I spell that right. So now what I've essentially done is created 3 functions that allow us to parse out that data. So we can say that's going to take in our data like this. And we're just going to parse out the sections we need. We know that this has a current underscore weather property and a daily property based on the console log output that we just looked at. And what we can do, if I just make sure I clean this up a little bit, for some reason I thought I was using an arrow function there, which is obviously not correct. There we go. So now here I want to return an object, and this object is just going to contain everything we need. So we need to get the current temperature. So we're going to say current temp. we're going to need to get the high temperature. So we're going to say high temp. We need to have a low temp. We need to have a high feels like. There we go. We need to have a low for the feels like. We need to have our wind speed, our precipitation, and then finally, we're going to have like our icon code, just like that. So these are the different things that we need to get from the API. So to get that, we can pull it from our data. So I'm going to destructure out our data from our current weather, just like this. And the things I want to get are going to be a temperature variable, which we're just going to call current temp, just like that. I'm going to get our wind speed, which is spelled out as one word like this. I'm going to convert it just so it's being capitalized as we would expect in JavaScript. And our weather code is going to be our icon code. So those are the three different things that we're getting from our current temp. I'm just going to put these on new lines so it's a little bit easier to read. There we go. And then what we can do is we can pass those in. So for our current temp, we already have that. For our wind speed, we have that. And for our icon code, we have that. So we don't even need to worry about passing those at all. The next thing we need to do is try to get this other information. And this is a little bit more tricky. If we look again at the actual object that's being returned to us, and if we just come up here, get rid of this .then for now. So I'll just put this down here and comment it out. There we go. And then I'll comment out this code right here, just because it's giving us errors. If we look over here, inspect this real quick. In our current, we have all that information that we pulled out, but how do we get the actual current for other things? Well, if we look in the hourly, we have a bunch of arrays, and the very first value in the array is the most recent value for that. So the most recent precipitation is going to be the first value in the array. Same thing for temperature and so on. So we can just get the first value from the array for all these different properties, and that'll give us whatever the most recent or current temperature or so on is. So again, I can use destructuring for this. From our daily values, what I want to do is I want to get the temperature that is the 2 meter max. This is going to be an array. And what I want to do is I want to destructure that array to get only the first value and rename it to max temp. What this is doing is essentially the same thing as saying this: daily dot temperature 2 meter max of 0. These two lines of code right here do the exact same thing. So I'm just getting the very first value from that array, and I need to do that for a bunch of different properties. For example, I need to get the min as well. So let's change this to min and change this to min. Then I need to do the same thing for our parent temperatures. So a parent temperature max right here is going to be our max feels like. I'm going to get the exact same thing for our min of that. So our min and our min. And then finally here, we're going to get our precipitation, which is called precipitation sum. We're just going to call that precip. That right there is all the data we need. So if we comment this back in, we can just say that we have our high temp, which is just called max temp. We're going to have our low temp, which is called min temp. Our max feels like, our min feels like, and then our precipitation, just like that. So now we've essentially taken all of the data that was difficult to parse and turned it into something that's really easy, and we can just plug straight into our UI essentially. The only last step we have is to deal with things like rounding, because for example, our current temperature could be a decimal point. We just want a round number. So I'm actually going to change this to math.round of our current temperature. Same thing with our high temperature. I want to round this. Same thing with that temperature and that temperature and that temperature. I essentially want to round every single number to a whole number just so our UI is a little bit cleaner. For our wind speed, I want to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to round out our wind speed. For our precipitation, I want to do this rounding as well, but I want to round it to a little bit more precision. So I can say that my precipitation here, I'm going to multiply it by 100 and then divide by 100, and that's rounding to the nearest 100th essentially. So now if we come up here and we comment back in this section, and we're just going to get rid of the two functions that don't exist. So we're just going to be returning that current data to us. If we inspect our page, we look at the console, you'll notice we're getting undefined returned. I believe that's because inside here, yeah, we're logging out res.data. Let's just change this to data because we're getting data essentially back. We don't get a response anymore. And then inside of here, I'm also going to remove this comment because we don't need it. So now if I inspect our page, we should see in the console we now have an object which has current, and it just has all the data we want perfectly parsed, which is great. Next up, I want to do the exact same thing for our daily temperature. So we can just scroll down here. Let's comment this in, and we can say function parse daily weather. It's going to take in some data. In our case, all we care about is the daily data. And And what I want to do, this is essentially an object. So I want to loop through this object. I want to get the time value, and this time value is just an array. So we're going to map over that array. So we're going to get time as well as the index that we are looping through. So to show you exactly what I'm talking about, we can just change this to say return data dot, return data, that's fine. And if we inspect our page, it should hopefully just be printing out our data. It is. And if we look at daily, you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different arrays. So what I'm doing is I'm just looping through this first array, and I'm going to be getting the index value as well as the value, and that index will allow me to essentially access each index in all of these other arrays. So when I'm on this value of time, I can get that value in all of the other arrays as well, and that'll give me the current value for that day. So like it'll give me the current temperature or time or whatever. So to do that, let's go back into here where we have our parse daily. We're looping through everything. We get our time and our index, and I just want to return to us an object that contains the data we need. All we need is the date. We need the actual temperature and the icon. Super simple. So we're going to get a timestamp for the current time, and that's just going to be our time value. But we need to multiply that by 1000 because this API returns to us the timestamp in seconds, and JavaScript expects it in milliseconds. So we're just converting to milliseconds. Next, we need the icon code, which is just our daily.weather code. And we want to get the value at the current index. So if we're on day 1, this will give us day 1, day 2, and so on. Then we got our max temp, and we want to round this. Oops, let me make sure this is camel case. So let's do a math.round of our daily.temp 2 meter max at the current index. So now if I come up here, don't return that data, give us a quick save, we now should hopefully have information being returned for our current and our daily is just an array that has a timestamp, icon code, and max temp for all of the different times and days that are being used, so all 7 days. Lastly, we need to parse our hourly weather, which is going to be very similar to our daily weather. So we can say parse hourly weather. Inside of here, we need our hourly, and we're also going to need our current weather because we need to know what hour to start at. Because when I started this, it was 3 p.m. my time. That's why my first time here is 3 p.m. But if I was checking at 6 p.m., I want my first time to be 6 p.m. So this current weather is just going to make sure we cut off the hourly at whatever the current time is. So to see what hourly is returning, let's change this back to return data. Give this a quick inspect over here. And if we look inside of our hourly, you can see it's exactly the same format as daily, just much larger list. And if we check our current weather, you can see the current time right here. That's like the current hour that we are in. So it's really useful to have that information. So back down into the parse hourly weather, what we can do is essentially the same thing that we did in our daily. So we can get our hourly dot time. We can map over that and get our time and our index values, and then just return all the data we need. So inside of here, we want our timestamp, which is just our time times 1000. Perfect. We need our icon code, and this icon code is hourly.weather code at the current index. We're going to do the same thing for our temperature, and we're going to make sure this is rounded. So hourly.temperature 2 meter, and this is just going to be 2 meter, no maximum, because we're just getting the actual temperature at that hour. There we go. I'm going to copy this down a couple times because we're also going to have our feels like, which is very similar. This is just going to say apparent temperature with no maximum. Then we're going to have our wind speed like this. And the wind speed is wind speed, underscore 10 meters. And then finally, the last thing we need is our precipitation. So this is going to be at precipitation. And this one I want to multiply by 100 and divide by 100 just to give me that extra precision on my rounding. Now that'll give us all of the hours, but we haven't filtered by what our current time is using this current weather. So to do that, we can do a simple filter at the end here. And I know that this object has a timestamp property inside of it because of what we're returning right here. So I know we have a timestamp here. And what I could do is I can just check to see when my timestamp is greater than or equal to my current weather.time. And I just need to multiply that by 1000 since I multiplied my original time by 1000. So they both are the same units. And this current weather time always returns to us the current hour that we're inside of. So as long as this is greater than or equal to, that means it is either the hour I'm currently in or it's some hour in the future. And that's all I need to do for parsing my hourly weather. And if I remove this return here, inspect our page, we should hopefully see in the console, we have an object which has our hourly weather, and you can see for each hour, we have all of the information we need for that hour to render it out. So now what we can do, we can close out of this real quick. Let's scroll up and let's go into our main page here. And instead of doing our dot then like this, where we're actually, writing out the function by hand, let's just call a function called render weather. And this is going to render our weather information to the screen. So render weather, just like that. Then we also want to put a dot catch on here just in case something goes wrong. So inside of this dot catch, what we can do is we can just say that we want a console.error out the error, and we can just alert to the user error getting weather. Sure, that's fine. It doesn't really matter. This is for testing purposes. So for rendering our weather data, we know we have a current, a daily, and an hourly, just like that. So now what we can do is we can actually render that data. And what I want to do is just use individual functions. So render current weather. We're going to pass in our current. We're going to render our daily weather, and we're going to pass in our daily. And then we're going to render our hourly weather and pass in our hourly. Also, the very last thing I want to do is I want to get my body, and I want to remove that blurred class. So remove blurred, just like that. So now if I just comment this out for now, give this a quick save, I add that blurred class all the way at the top here. So we just say class blurred. Now what's going to happen is you can see briefly we have the blurred class, and then the blurred class goes away as soon as our data is done loading, which is exactly what we want. All we have left to do is actually render it. So let's start with our current weather. So we'll say function render current weather, and this is going to be taking in all that current data. We'll just say current, just like that. And then what we want to do is we essentially want to set a bunch of values on something. So if we go to our HTML, for example, inside of our header, we have this data current temp. So what we can do is we can say document.query selector data current temp. And then what we want to do is we actually want to set the value for that. So we can say dot text content is equal to whatever the value is. Let's say it's current dot current temp. There we go. So now hopefully our current temp up here is being set. As you can see, it says 67, which is the current temperature being returned by this API. Quite warm. Now this is going to be a bit of a pain because we're going to have to do this a bunch of times. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a helper function. This function, I'm just going to call set value, and it's going to take in a selector, and it's going to take in a value. And then optionally, I'm going to pass it a parent, but by default, I want that to be the document object. So what I can do is I can take our parent, which by default is the document. I can do that query selector. Whoops, query selector. I know that I used data attributes for everything, so I can just come in here, I can paste down that data, and I can just put our selector in the middle. So I know for a fact I always started everything with data dash, so I can just pass in everything after that. And then I can say my text content is equal to that value. So now I can come down here, set value for current temp, and I can pass it my current temp. That simple little fix right there has made my code so much easier, because now, as you can see, this current temp is still being set, but my code is much easier to read. And I can do that for essentially all of my different values. So we're going to have our current temp, we're going to have our current high, we're going to have our low, we're going to have our feels like high, our feels like low, our wind, and our precipitation. And for all of these, we can just say we have our high temp, low temp, high feels like, low feels like, wind speed, and our precipitation. So there we go. All of the values over here are now properly being set. All we need to do is make it so our icon is the correct icon. So we need to get our current icon dot source, but we need to select our current icon. So let's just say const current icon is equal to document dot query selector of that data current icon. There we go. And I want the source to be equal to our icon URL. But again, we're going to have to set this a bunch of times, as you can see by all the icons on our page. So let's create a function for that. Get icon URL, and we're going to pass it in the code that we want, which is our icon code. So let's create a function, get icon URL, which takes in a code. We need to return a path, which is icons slash, and then we need to convert that code to essentially an SVG file. So somehow we need to take our code, whoops, and convert it to an SVG. Well, if we go over to the API we're using, these are all the different codes that we can get returned to us. As you can see, there are a ton of different codes, essentially 0 to 100 with some of them missing. And they all correspond to different things, but we can group a lot of them together into different sections. And the best way to do this is going to be with a map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new file called icon map.js. This is essentially going to be a legit JavaScript map. So we're going to export const icon map, which is just going to be a new map. And then down here, I want to add some different mappings. So I can say like icon map.set 0 is going to be for our sun because that's a clear sky. So we're going to have our sun icon, for example. I also want to set 1 equal to our sun icon because it's also meaning mainly clear. And a lot of different icons are going to have multiple of the same symbol. So I'm going to create a really simple helper function that'll make this easier, called add mapping, which is going to take an array of values and the actual icon we want. So I can call this function, pass it 0 and 1 and the value sun, and it'll essentially output this code right here for me. So I'm just going to loop through all my values. Whoops, for each value. What I want to do is I want to call icon map.set, where I take the value and set it to my icon. That's all this does. So now those two lines of code are the same, so I just condensed it down to here. Next, I want to add a mapping for 2, which is partly cloudy. So I have an icon called cloud sun, which is a cloud and a sun, partly cloudy. Icon 3 means that it's fully cloudy, overcast, so we're going to use the cloud icon. Then for 45 and 48, that essentially means that we have some level of fog. So I'm going to use my smog icon, which is my fog icon. And then I'm going to copy over this next mapping because it's very long. So this next mapping is for anything that deals with rain. So as you can see, there are tons of codes for dealing with rain of various different levels and degrees. And that's just going to be our showers heavy icon. I'm going to copy over these last two as well because they are pretty lengthy. So again, we have stuff for snow, which is going to be our snow icon. And then finally our cloud bolt. So I just essentially went through, read every single icon to see what they went with, and just tried to map them to the icons that I have to the best of my ability. So now we essentially can just say icon map.get, pass it a code, and it's going to return to us essentially the name of my SVG. So what I can do in the main file here is I can use that icon map.get and pass it in our icon code. I just need to make sure I import this at the top of my file. So get that from /icon map just like that. So now hopefully if we've done that right, we should have got our icon properly. Obviously we have an error though. I believe it's because, yes, this is not a default export, this is a named export. And that fixed our problem, and now you can see it showing the sun icon, which is because it's currently sunny in whatever location is at 1010. Now let's move on to the next section where we're rendering out our daily weather. So we can just create a function for that. Render daily weather, it's going to take in our daily weather. And inside of here, we're going to do a lot of the same stuff we did up here. First, I want to select the things we need. For example, we need our daily section. So that's document.querySelector of data day section, just like that. And we also need to have our day card template. That's the template we created, which essentially tells us what each card looks like. And this one we gave an ID of day card template, just like that. So we have our section and we have our template. For our section, I want to first just remove everything from it. So inner HTML is blank. So if we just save this, you can see the day section has been removed. That's great because now we can add in our cards one by one. So for each one of our days, let's loop through that and get our day. And what I want to do is I want to create a brand new element, which is a clone of our template. So we can say element equals day card template dot clone node, or sorry, content dot clone node. And we pass in true, and that'll just make sure it clones all of its children as well. So this is how you clone a template essentially. And then what we can do is we can use that set value function where I can say, hey, I want to set the data temp. If we look at our HTML, and if we just go down to that section, you can see we have that data temp right here that we're trying to set. So the data temp, I want to set to my day.max temperature value. And the important thing is the parent is a current element that I'm working on. So I want to search within this element that I just created to actually set that value. Now I want to do the exact same thing with my data date. And in this case, I want to get the time. So this is the timestamp, but I want to convert this to obviously a readable value. So I'm going to create a simple formatter, which we're just going to call day formatter. And it's going to be intl.datetime_format. And I want to create a new one of those. So we'll say it's going to be a new one of those. Pass in undefined as my locale, so to use my default locale. And I want to pass in some values for my weekday. So I can see weekday. And I want to pass this in as long. So what this is going to do is it's just going to run a formatter that's going to return just the day portion of my weekday. So I can say day formatter.format and pass it in that timestamp, and it'll now format my actual day as a day instead of a date that has a bunch of other information. So once we have all that done, we can then take our element and we can get the actual icon as well. So we're going to query selector for that data icon. Oops, make sure I do that ordering correctly. There we go. And the source we're going to set to get icon URL of our day.icon code. And then finally, we're just going to take our daily section and append that new element we just created on the end. So now you can see each day has been added with that element. And this date formatter right here is what's giving us that date. If we, for example, change this to say short instead of long, you can now see this as a shortened version of our day. And the great thing is if you change your language to like Spanish, for example, it'll show the Spanish date, which is great. Now, the last thing we have left is going to be this hourly section before we move on to actually getting our local location. So let's create a function. And we're going to say render hourly weather. It's going to take in our hourly weather. And this is honestly going to be very similar to what we had up here. So I'm going to copy this code right here for our formatters and stuff, because we're going to have essentially an hour formatter. We're going to have an hourly section, which is data hour section. There we go. And we're going to have an hour row template, just like that. Or it's called hour row template. Now for our hour formatter, all we need to do instead of weekday is we're going to say hour, and instead of long, I want to say numeric. There we go. Now inside of this rendering, it's going to be very similar to what we have here. I'm just going to copy it down exactly. So we're going to have our hourly section, and we're going to remove all of the HTML inside of it. And then we're going to loop through each of our hours. For each hour, we're going to clone our template to get a new element, and then we're just going to essentially set a bunch of different values. So for our temperature, we're going to get our hour.maxTemp. For our feels like temp, we're going to get our hour.feelslike. So let me just copy this down. Feels like temp is hour.feelslike. There we go. Copy this down a bunch more times. We're going to have our wind, our precipitation. We're going to have our day. And then finally, we're going to have the actual time. So for wind, this is just wind speed. There we go. For our precipitation, it's just called precip. And then we need to do our formatter. So I'm going to copy over the day formatter, because that's what we're going to use here. And we're going to pass it our hour.timestamp. So this will format our essential current timestamp as a day. So you can see it says Thursday right here. Then we want to get the time. And we're just going to use our hour formatter and pass it in the exact same time. And it'll just format it as an hour for us instead. The final thing we need to do is get the icon code. And we're going to set the data icon for that. And then we're going to add on our hourly section and append that element. So if I give that a quick save, you can now see we have a bunch of stuff showing up, even though it looks like our temperature section is incorrect. The reason for that is this should say temp instead of max temp. And now you can see this is looking really good. Let's just expand this. And you can see everything for our dates and our times are showing up correctly. It's only showing up as the times that are after my current time, because I'm currently recording after 4 p.m. So that's why 4 p.m. is the first one that shows up. And you can see all this other information is showing up, and it looks really, really good. Now, the last step that we have is to actually hook it up to our current location. This may sound really complicated, but it's actually incredibly easy. Let's just go all the way to the top of our page. What I want to do is I want to say navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition, and we need to pass it two callbacks, a success and a failure. So we're just going to say position success and position error, just like that. And we're going to create two functions for that. So we're going to say function position success. Make sure I spell function properly. There we go. In the success function, that's where we're going to call get weather. And all we need to do is pass it in our coordinates, which coincidentally come in as a value for this function. So we can say chords.latitude and chords.longitude. And that right there is going to pass in the information we need. So we have our latitude and longitude being passed in. Now we just need to create our error function. So position error. And all we can just say is alert. And I'll just copy over the alert message that I used. Whoops. There we go. Alert. And essentially it's just saying, hey, there's an error getting your location. Make sure you allow us to use your location. And now it's getting my current temperature and location, where it's currently raining and 31 degrees outside. If for some reason I had this set to block and I refresh my page, you can see it's going to give us an error, and it's going to make sure that I come up here and select that I want to actually allow my information to be used. And then when I refresh, it'll get my information. And that's all it takes to create this weather app. If you want to create more projects like this and learn JavaScript from scratch, you're definitely going to want to check out my JavaScript Simplified course. It'll be linked down in the description below. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.